Emma slouched against the counter of her new kitchen, staring out the window at the dreary gray sky. The small town had seemed charming when she first arrived, a perfect place to start over after the nightmare of her breakup. But now, as she looked out at the quiet street and the dense woods beyond, she felt more alone than ever. Her new house was still half empty, boxes scattered around like the remnants of her past life, the life she had been so eager to escape. Her phone buzzed on the counter, jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A message from Rachel. "On my way. Got a surprise for you." Emma sighed, a small smile forming on her lips. Rachel was always the optimist, the one who refused to let Emma wallow in her misery. A visit from her best friend would be a welcome distraction from the overwhelming silence that filled the house. She spent the next half hour tidying up, though there wasn't much to tidy. She had yet to fully unpack. As she picked up a box marked living room, there was a knock at the door. Rachel stood there, grinning ear to ear, a large brown paper bag clutched in her arms. "I come bearing gifts," she announced, brushing past Emma into the living room. Emma laughed despite herself. "Gifts? You know you don't have to." "Shush," Rachel interrupted, setting the bag on the coffee table. "You need this. Trust me." She reached into the bag and pulled out an object wrapped in tissue paper. With a flourish, she revealed the gift. A doll. Emma's smile faltered slightly as she took in the doll's appearance. It was old-fashioned, with a porcelain face that was eerily lifelike. Its eyes were a vivid blue, almost too real, framed by thick lashes. It wore a delicate lace dress, white with tiny embroidered flowers, and its hands were painted to resemble tiny, delicate fingers. It was both beautiful and unsettling, like something that belonged in an antique store window, not in her new modern home. "Wow," Emma said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "It's really something." "I know, right?" Rachel said, her eyes shining with excitement. "I found it at this quirky little antique shop in town. The woman who sold it to me said it was one of a kind, even hinted at some sort of history behind it. I thought it would add a touch of character to this place. It needs a bit of warmth, don't you think?" Emma nodded slowly, though a cold shiver ran down her spine as she looked into the doll's eyes. There was something off about it, something that made her want to look away. But she didn't want to disappoint Rachel. "Yeah," she said, forcing a smile. "You're right, it'll give the place a personality." Rachel beamed, clearly pleased with herself. "I knew you'd love it. Let's put it on the shelf over there." Without waiting for a response, she walked over to the built-in bookshelf in the living room and placed the doll on the middle shelf, positioning it so it faced out into the room. As the afternoon wore on, the two friends chatted and laughed, Emma feeling a bit of her old self return in Rachel's presence. They drank wine, reminisced about their college days, and for a while, Emma managed to push aside the lingering unease she felt about the doll. It sat on the shelf, silently observing, its glassy eyes reflecting the room's light in a way that made them almost seem to follow the conversation. By the time Rachel left, it was nearing dusk. Emma walked her to the door, thanking her again for the visit. As she closed the door behind her friend, the house seemed to grow instantly colder, the silence more pronounced. Emma turned back to the living room, her gaze inevitably drawn to the doll. It sat there, perfectly still, but it dominated the room in a way that none of her other belongings did. Its eyes seemed to glint in the dimming light. "You're being ridiculous," Emma muttered to herself, rubbing her arms against a sudden chill. It was just a doll, an inanimate object. It couldn't hurt her. She turned on the TV, trying to fill the space with sound, and sat on the couch with a book. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, her eyes kept drifting back to the doll. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the room fell into darkness except for the soft glow of the TV. Emma felt herself growing drowsy, lulled by the noise in the wine. Her eyelids grew heavy and she drifted off into a fitful sleep. It was the middle of the night when she woke up with a start. The TV was off, the room pitch black. Her heart pounded in her chest, though she couldn't remember what had startled her awake. She sat up, listening. The house was silent, too silent. It was as if the walls were holding their breath. Emma reached for the lamp on the side table, her hand trembling. The light clicked on, casting a warm glow across the room. She looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows, and then, almost involuntarily, they settled on the doll. It had moved. Emma blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She had placed it on the middle shelf, facing forward. Now it sat slightly to the left, its head tilted just enough that it seemed to be looking at the spot where she had been sitting on the couch. "No," she whispered, standing up. "No, I must have moved it. Or Rachel did." She approached the doll slowly, her mind racing to find a rational explanation. She reached out to touch it, to prove to herself that it was just a toy, nothing more. The moment her fingers brushed against the porcelain, a shock of cold shot up her arm, and she jerked back with a gasp. It felt like touching ice. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The doll remained where it was, head tilted, eyes staring. Emma backed away, her breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. She hurried into the kitchen, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the light switch. The fluorescent bulbs flickered on, flooding the room with harsh light. She leaned against the counter, trying to calm herself. "It's just stress," she whispered. "You're imagining things. It's been a long day and you're tired." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something was watching her. The thought of returning to the living room made her skin crawl, but she couldn't just leave the doll there. Not like this. Summoning what little courage she had left, Emma forced herself to walk back into the living room. The doll was exactly where she had left it, its position unchanged. She let out a shaky breath. Maybe she had imagined it moving. Maybe she was just losing her mind. She reached out again, this time lifting the doll carefully off the shelf. It was heavier than she expected, its body cold and stiff in her hands. She carried it to the hall closet, opened the door, and set it on the top shelf, facing the back wall. She closed the door, turned the lock, and took a step back, feeling a small sense of relief wash over her. "There," she said, as if speaking to someone else. "Out of sight, out of mind." She returned to the living room and turned on every light, refusing to sit in the dark again. She stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the windows, her eyes fixed on the closet door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But it didn't. The door remained closed, the house quiet. Emma forced herself to breathe, to relax, though the sense of unease never truly left her. It was just a doll, after all. An innocent gift from a friend. Nothing more. Or so she tried to convince herself. But as the days passed and the shadows in her home grew longer, Emma would come to realize that some gifts carry a weight all their own, a weight that presses down on the soul, whispering secrets in the dark, secrets that are far from innocent. Days bled into weeks, and Emma found herself increasingly isolated in her new home. The doll, now locked away in the hall closet, should have been out of sight, out of mind, but its presence lingered like a dark stain in the back of her thoughts. She could feel it there, a weight pressing down on her, always watching even from behind the wooden door. Her dreams grew more vivid, more unsettling. Each night, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the doll would appear. The dreams began simply enough. She would be standing in her living room, everything normal, except the air would be thick, almost suffocating. She would turn, and there it would be, sitting on the shelf where it had been before she locked it away. Its glassy eyes were no longer inanimate. They were alive, dark, and knowing, piercing into her. In these dreams, she felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away or move as the doll's gaze consumed her. Then the dreams escalated. The living room would decay before her eyes, the walls blackening as if being consumed by an unseen fire. The shadows would grow, stretching out from corners like living tendrils, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her toward the doll. In those moments, the doll would smile, a slow, twisted smile that cracked its porcelain face, revealing something dark and sinister beneath. She would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. The image of that broken smile burned into her mind. Emma's sleep-deprived state began to take a toll on her daily life. She stumbled through her days in a fog, barely managing to keep up with basic tasks. She called Rachel once, trying to explain what was happening, but the words felt hollow, paranoid even, as they spilled from her lips. Rachel's concerned voice on the other end of the line offered comfort, but Emma could hear the doubt in her friend's tone, the subtle disbelief. After that, Emma stopped reaching out. It was easier to keep it to herself, to bear the burden alone than to risk being seen as unstable. The whispering began soon after. At first, it was faint, a soft murmuring that she dismissed as the wind howling through the old house's crevices. But the whispers grew more distinct, taking on a childlike quality, a plaintive voice that sent chills down her spine. It seemed to emanate from the walls, surrounding her no matter where she was in the house. She couldn't make out the words at first, just the tone. Pleading, sad, and full of a quiet rage that made her skin crawl. It was late one night when the whispers became clear. Emma had been lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, sleep eluding her as usual. The house was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on her bedside table. She closed her eyes, willing herself to drift off when she heard it, faint and haunting like the voice of a child, just outside her door. Find me. Save me. Emma bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears, listening. The voice was gone, replaced by the oppressive silence. She glanced at the door, half expecting it to creak open on its own, but it remained closed. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It was just her mind playing tricks on her, she reasoned. Sleep deprivation, stress. There were logical explanations. She lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin. But the moment she closed her eyes, the whisper returned, louder this time, the words cutting through the stillness of the room. Save me. She won't let me go. Emma's eyes flew open. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A cold sweat broke out on her skin, and she realized she was holding her breath. She forced herself to exhale, to think rationally. Slowly, she pushed back the covers and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the cold hardwood floor, and she winced at the chill that seeped into her bones. She had to confront this, whatever it was. She had to know. Taking a deep breath, she moved toward the hallway, her steps slow and deliberate. The hall was darker than usual, the shadows deepening with each step she took. She reached the closet door where the doll was locked away, and as she stood before it, the air around her grew colder, the whispering intensifying. Find me, please. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to flee. But something compelled her forward, a force she couldn't name. Her fingers closed around the knob, twisting it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the doll sitting exactly where she had left it on the top shelf, facing the back wall. Emma let out a shuddering breath, staring at the back of the doll's head. The voice had stopped, leaving only the heavy silence. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the doll. She had to know. She reached up, gripping the doll by its shoulders, and turned it to face her. Its eyes locked onto hers, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt. The room around her warped, the walls bending and twisting as if they were made of liquid. The doll's face shifted before her eyes, its porcelain surface rippling as if something beneath it was trying to break free. Emma stumbled back, dropping the doll, and it landed on the floor with a sickening thud, its glassy eyes never leaving her. The shadows around the closet deepened, stretching across the floor toward her. A shape began to form within them. A small figure, childlike but distorted, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure emerged from the darkness, a grotesque silhouette that exuded a palpable sense of malice. The air around her grew colder, and the scent of lavender filled her nostrils, overpowering and sickly sweet. The child's voice returned, but it was no longer a whisper. It was a scream, a high, keening wail that reverberated through her skull, each note a blade slicing through her sanity. "Help me! She's here! She won't let me go!" Emma clapped her hands over her ears, sinking to her knees. The shadowy figure loomed over her, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her cheeks as the voice echoed in her mind, relentless and agonized. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the screaming stopped. The air grew still, the lavender scent dissipating as quickly as it had come. Emma opened her eyes slowly, her body trembling. The shadow was gone, the closet empty except for the doll lying on the floor, its eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. Emma crawled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was paralyzed by a terror so profound it rooted her to the spot. The doll hadn't moved. She knew that logically, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been the source of the voice, that it was somehow alive and aware of her. Hours passed before she could bring herself to move. When she finally stood, her legs were numb, and her hands shook violently as she picked up the doll and shoved it back into the closet. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart pounding in her chest. Emma stumbled back to her bedroom, every nerve on edge, half expecting the whispers to return, for the shadow to seep back into the room. But the house was silent again, the only sound the ticking of the clock by her bed. She collapsed onto the mattress, curling into a ball, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door. Sleep was impossible. The darkness was full of eyes and whispers and shadows that she could feel pressing in on her. She stayed awake until dawn, the first light of day bringing with it a fragile sense of safety. But as she lay there, the echoes of the voice still haunted her mind. "Find me. Save me." The words repeated over and over, burrowing into her consciousness like a dark seed. And in that quiet moment, Emma realized with a chilling certainty that the doll was more than a simple gift. It was a conduit, a doorway to something far darker than she could comprehend. The shadows in her home were not empty. They were alive, filled with the presence of something that watched her, whispered to her, and slowly, inexorably tightened its grip on her soul. Emma's world had shrunk to the confines of her house. Days passed in a blur of creeping shadows and half-heard whispers that twisted through her mind like a snake, leaving her tense and paranoid. Every corner, every darkened hallway, every creak of the old wood underfoot became a potential threat. The doll remained locked in the hall closet, but its presence was everywhere. It was as if the house itself had become a living entity, its walls breathing, its shadows watching. Sleep was a fleeting, fractured thing, and when it came, it brought no relief. Emma's dreams had become nightmares, a labyrinth of terror where she wandered through a version of her house that was decayed and rotting. The floors were covered in a thick black ooze that clung to her feet, and the air was choked with the cloying scent of lavender. The doll was always there, a silent sentinel in every room, its eyes following her, its mouth twisted into that horrid smile. She would wake in the middle of the night, her throat raw from screaming, the darkness around her pressing in like a shroud. The The house would be silent, but it was the kind of silence that hummed with hidden menace, a silence that screamed of things unseen lurking just out of sight. And through it all, the whispers persisted, seeping into her waking hours, tugging at the frayed edges of her sanity. Emma knew she was losing her grip on reality. She could feel it slipping away, piece by piece. The line between the real world and the horrors in her mind had blurred beyond recognition. Her only anchor was the belief that if she could uncover the doll's past, she might find a way to stop the nightmare. It had to have come from somewhere, had to have a story that could explain the dark presence that now haunted her every waking moment. She began her search with the antique store where Rachel had bought the doll. It had been a quaint, unassuming place on the edge of town, a dusty little shop crammed with relics from forgotten eras. When Emma drove there one afternoon, she found nothing but a charred ruin. The building had burned to the ground, its skeletal remains standing like the blackened bones of a long-dead beast. A sense of dread washed over her as she stared at the ruins, the cold October wind whipping through the open car window. Emma asked around town, desperate for any scrap of information. The townsfolk were reticent at first, giving her wary glances when she mentioned the shop and the doll. But eventually an elderly woman at the local diner gave her a lead. The shop had been owned by an eccentric old woman, rumored to be involved in occult practices. The townspeople had always whispered about her, about the cursed items she sold, each with a history of misfortune and death. There was talk, the old woman said, her voice a hoarse whisper, about a child who went missing many years ago. They say the doll has something to do with it. Emma felt a chill crawl down her spine. What happened to the child? The woman shook her head. No one knows. Some say the doll was made as a vessel, a prison for the child's spirit. Others say it's not the child at all, but something darker, something that pretends to be a child to lure you in. Emma left the diner with a gnawing sense of horror. If the doll was a vessel, a prison for a spirit, or something darker, what had she let into her home, into her life? She spent days poring over old newspapers in the local library, searching for any mention of the missing child, and then she found it. An article from over 30 years ago about a girl named Lila who had vanished without a trace. The photograph accompanying the article sent a jolt of recognition through Emma. The girl's face was eerily similar to the doll's, the same delicate features, the same haunting blue eyes. The details were sparse. Lila had disappeared one cold October evening, and despite an extensive search, no trace of her was ever found. Her mother, it was rumored, had dabbled in the occult in a desperate attempt to bring her daughter back. The townspeople spoke of strange rituals and dark magic, of a curse that had settled over the family. But there was no proof, only whispers. Emma's hands shook as she read the article. It felt like the room around her was closing in, the walls pressing inward. Lila's story was tragic, but it didn't explain the doll. Not completely. If the doll was indeed connected to Lila, why was it tormenting her now? What did it want? She returned home that evening with a newfound resolve. She had to confront the doll, to face whatever it was that lurked behind those glassy eyes. But the moment she stepped through her front door, she felt it, an oppressive weight, a suffocating presence that clung to her like a shroud. The shadows in the house had deepened, taking on a life of their own. They twisted and shifted in the corners of her vision, crawling along the walls like living creatures. The whispers started again, rising from the walls, the floor, the very air around her. Find me, free me, before it's too late. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the hall closet. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold, a biting chill that seeped into her skin. She hesitated, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices now. Lila's voice, begging for release, mingled with a darker, more sinister voice that promised nothing but despair. She turned the knob and pulled the door open. The doll sat on the top shelf, exactly as she had left it. But now it was different. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, and its mouth seemed to have twisted into a faint, mocking smile. The shadows in the closet writhed, forming a shape, a child's form, distorted and wrong, its limbs stretched and twisted into grotesque angles. Emma stumbled back, a scream lodged in her throat. The figure emerged from the shadows, its face a blur of darkness except for the eyes, those haunting blue eyes that bore into hers with an intensity that made her knees go weak. The room around her seemed to pulse and contract, the walls warping as if they were made of flesh. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and hollow. "She is mine. You cannot save her. You can only join her." Emma backed away, her mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. The entity moved closer, its form shifting, becoming more defined. She could see the outline of a child's dress, the tangle of hair, but the face remained obscured, a void that threatened to swallow her whole. "No," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I won't let you take me." The shadows lunged, and she screamed, slamming the closet door shut. The house shook with the force of the impact, the lights flickering as if the power itself was being drained by the dark presence. Emma stumbled into the living room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to get out. She had to escape this place. But as she reached the front door, it slammed shut in her face, the lock clicking into place. She yanked on the handle, panic surging through her. The door wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The whispers surrounded her, rising to a fever pitch, the voices of children and the guttural tones of something ancient and vile. "Join us. Join us." Emma collapsed to the floor, her hands clamped over her ears. The room darkened, the shadows converging around her, pressing in on all sides. The doll's laughter echoed through the house, a high tinkling sound that chilled her to the core. She looked up, her vision blurring, and saw the doll standing in the doorway to the hallway. It was moving now, its limbs jerking in unnatural puppet-like motions, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. She crawled backward, her mind racing for a way out, a way to end this nightmare. And then, through the haze of terror, a thought emerged. She had to destroy the doll. She had to sever its connection to this world. It was the only way to free herself and Lila, if Lila still existed somewhere within the darkness. Emma scrambled to her feet, her eyes locked on the doll. It advanced slowly, its movements grotesque and mechanical. She backed into the kitchen, her hand groping blindly for something, anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around the handle of a large kitchen knife, and she grasped it tightly, the metal cold against her palm. The doll paused at the threshold of the kitchen, tilting its head as if mocking her. The shadows writhed around it, the dark presence coiling and uncoiling like a serpent. Emma raised the knife, her arm trembling. "This ends now," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The doll lunged, and Emma swung the knife down with all her strength. The blade met porcelain, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The room exploded in a blinding flash of light, the shadows screaming and convulsing as they were ripped apart. The lavender scent vanished, replaced by the acrid stench of burning. Emma was thrown backward, hitting the floor hard, the wind knocked out of her. When she opened her eyes, the kitchen was in ruins, the walls scorched and blackened. In the center of the room lay the remains of the doll, shattered into fragments. But the presence was gone. The shadows were just shadows now, the air still and silent. Emma crawled forward, her hands shaking as she reached for the pieces of the doll. Among the shards of porcelain, she found a small, charred photograph. She picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. It was a picture of Lila, the girl from the newspaper, her face smiling and innocent. But behind her, faint and ghostly, stood the shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with the same malevolence she had seen in the doll. Emma dropped the photograph, a sob escaping her lips. The horror wasn't over. It had merely shifted, changed form. As she stared at the broken pieces of the doll, a new terror gripped her, a fear that the darkness had not been destroyed, only released. And somewhere, in the deepest recesses of her mind, she heard the faintest whisper. "I'm free now." Emma sank to the floor, her mind unraveling completely. The room around her faded, dissolving into shadows, until there was nothing left but darkness. Emma awoke to the hollow quiet of dawn, the gray light seeping into the charred remains of her kitchen. She lay on the cold floor, her body aching, her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. The previous night was a blurred nightmare, fragments of terror and violence that had bled into her reality. The doll was gone, shattered into pieces. But the silence that followed was not the peace she had hoped for. It was a silence of absence, an emptiness where something dark had once thrived. She pushed herself up, her movements slow and deliberate, as if any sudden action might stir the malevolent force that had haunted her for so long. The house was unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. Emma glanced around the room, her gaze falling on the remnants of the doll scattered across the floor. Shards of porcelain, a tangle of hair, the burnt photograph of Lila. Each piece was a reminder of the nightmare she had tried to escape. But as she stared at the debris, a new realization settled over her, heavy and cold. The doll had been destroyed, but the presence it harbored was not gone. She could feel it in the air, a low hum of malevolence that thrummed through the walls, a pulsing darkness that had not been banished, only unleashed. Her eyes drifted to the hallway, to the open closet door where the doll had been kept. Shadows pooled there, deep and impenetrable, writhing as if alive. A voice whispered through the house, soft and mocking, a twisted mimicry of a child's plea. "Thank you, Emma, for setting me free." Emma's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was not Lila's. It was something else, something ancient and unfathomable, wearing the guise of an innocent. It had deceived her, used her desperation to escape its porcelain prison. And now it was here, fully realized, a darkness that had been waiting for release. Her grip tightened around the knife she still held, the blade smeared with dark stains. The finality of what she needed to do settled into her bones. This was not over. Not yet. It had been a mistake to think she could simply destroy the vessel and be done with it. The entity had been bound to the doll, but now it roamed free, and it was up to her to confront it, one last time. She forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her. She moved toward the hallway, each step a battle against the rising tide of fear that threatened to consume her. The shadows in the corridor shifted, retreating into the deeper darkness as she approached, whispering and laughing. They led her, beckoning her toward the source of the malevolence, guiding her to the heart of the house where it had all begun. The door to the living room stood ajar, the room beyond it a murky void. Emma hesitated at the threshold, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could feel it on the other side, waiting for her, its presence a tangible weight pressing against her chest. The lavender scent filled her nose, sweet and overpowering, mingling with the acrid tang of burnt wood. "Come to me, Emma," the voice crooned, slithering into her mind. "You can't run, you can't hide, you are mine." She swallowed hard, her hand tightening on the knife. It was now or never. She stepped into the living room and the door swung shut behind her with a deafening slam, plunging the room into darkness. The shadows writhed, coiling around her ankles, pulling her toward the center of the room. She fought against them, her feet dragging across the floor as she was drawn toward the empty space where the doll's shelf had once stood. The darkness condensed before her, taking shape, solidifying into a figure. It was the silhouette of a child, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were too long, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, its eyes glowing with that familiar, piercing blue light. The figure stood there, its form shifting and blurring, a nightmare made flesh. Emma raised the knife, her hand shaking. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper. The figure smiled, a grotesque stretching of its face that revealed rows of needle-like teeth. "I am what you freed. I am what has always been." Its voice was a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of the child's cries, and the darker, deeper tones of something inhuman. "You thought you could save her, but there was never anything to save. There is only me." The room grew colder, the air thickening around her. Emma felt it pressing against her, suffocating her, pushing her toward the brink of madness. The figure advanced, its eyes locking onto hers, pulling her into its depths. She felt her will crumbling, the last vestiges of her sanity slipping away as the darkness closed in. "No," she gasped, forcing herself to step back, to fight. "I won't let you take me." The entity's smile widened, its eyes blazing with a cruel light. "You have no choice. You brought me here, you let me in, and now you will join me." It lunged, a mass of shadows and teeth and horror, and Emma screamed, raising the knife in a desperate arc. The blade sliced through the darkness, meeting resistance as if striking something solid. The figure recoiled with a shriek, the shadows shuddering and peeling away from it. Emma lunged again, her movements fueled by terror and rage, each strike a battle cry against the encroaching void. The entity howled, its form flickering, losing shape. For a brief moment, Emma glimpsed the face of a child within the darkness, eyes wide with fear and sorrow. And then it was gone, replaced by the hollow, leering visage of the darkness itself. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed, its voice rising in a maddening wail. "I am eternal. I am your fear, your despair." Emma felt herself weakening, her vision blurring as the shadows closed in. But as the darkness pressed against her, she remembered the words from the whispers, the pleading cries of the girl. There had been something true in them, a sliver of light amidst the dark. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand tall. "You might be eternal," she said, her voice steadying, "but you're not invincible." She dropped the knife, stepping back as the entity surged forward and reached into her pocket, pulling out the only thing she had left, the charred photograph of Lila. The entity hesitated, its form flickering, its confidence wavering for the first time. "No," it hissed, recoiling. "What are you doing?" Emma held the photograph out, her eyes locking onto the shadow's fiery gaze. "You lied to me. You used me to free yourself, but you're still bound to her." She took a step forward, pressing the photograph against the shadow's chest. "And I banish you back to the darkness you came from." The entity screamed, a sound that rattled the very foundations of the house. It twisted and writhed, the shadows tearing away from it in violent gusts. The photograph glowed with an ethereal light, a blinding radiance that cut through the gloom. The shadow shrieked, its form disintegrating into wisps of smoke, pulled toward the photograph like water down a drain. The room exploded in a burst of light, and Emma was thrown backward, hitting the floor hard. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. She lay there, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from the confrontation. When she finally opened her eyes, the room was bathed in the soft glow of dawn. The shadows were gone, the air warm and still. She sat up slowly, her gaze falling on the photograph lying in the center of the room. It was no longer charred, no longer twisted. It was whole, showing a young girl with bright eyes and a gentle smile, a girl who was finally at peace. Emma picked up the photograph, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. The house around her was quiet, the oppressive weight lifted. She had done it. She had faced the darkness and won. But as she stood there, the reality of what she had gone through settled over her like a shroud. The scars of this ordeal would remain with her, etched into her soul. She walked to the front door, the morning light spilling through the windows, a promise of a new beginning. As she opened the door and stepped outside, she felt a breeze brush against her face, carrying with it the faintest scent of lavender. Emma turned back one last time, her eyes scanning the house. It stood there, silent and unyielding, the shadows within it now mere echoes of the past. And in the doorway, just for a fleeting second, she thought she saw the figure of a young girl, standing quietly, watching her leave. Emma blinked, and the figure was gone. She took a deep breath and walked away, leaving behind the house, the doll, and the darkness that had tried to claim her. She was free. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that some part of the nightmare would always remain. A shadow at the edge of her vision, a whisper in the dark. The house stood silent as she disappeared down the road, the door slightly ajar. And from within the depths of its shadows, a soft, almost imperceptible laugh echoed, fading into the emptiness. Emma knew the truth. Some gifts can never be returned, and some darknesses once freed never truly fade away.